Today, we are diving into a book that didn't just add a new chapter to psychology, it pretty much forced the entire field to stop and rethink its own story. Carol Gilligan's In a Different Voice took decades of research and said, hey, wait a minute, we're only looking at one half of the picture here. So let's jump right into the big question her work makes us all ask.
Right? This is the question that's really at the heart of everything Gilligan was getting at. See, for most of the 20th century, psychology had this really clear step-by-step ladder for how we develop morally. But Gilligan started to notice that a whole lot of people, especially women, didn't seem to be climbing it the right way, which led her to wonder, was the problem with the people or was the problem with the ladder itself?
And this quote right here, this is where it all began. While she was doing her research, Gilligan heard something that other psychologists had either ignored or just completely missed. It wasn't one single, uniform voice of moral reasoning. No, she heard two totally distinct voices, almost like two different languages for talking about right and wrong. One was super familiar to the field. The other, well, that one was new.
Okay, so to really grasp how revolutionary this was, we first have to understand the world that Gilligan was questioning. The established, accepted view of how humans are supposed to develop.
So this traditional ladder had a surprisingly narrow foundation. I mean, think about it. Hugely influential theories, like the ones from Lawrence Kohlberg, were built almost entirely on studies of boys and men. His most famous one literally followed 84 boys for 20 years. And what came out of that? A model where growing up meant separating from everyone else, and where morality was all about a hierarchy of abstract rules. The absolute peak of maturity was seen as being totally autonomous.
And here's the real kicker. When women's moral reasoning didn't neatly fit this model, when it focused more on relationships and responsibilities than on abstract rules, it wasn't seen as just a different, equally valid way of thinking. Nope. It was seen as a developmental failure, a deviation from what was considered the male norm.
But Gilligan comes along and says, hold on. What if this isn't a failure at all? What if it's a completely different ethical framework? And to prove it, she brilliantly used a classic moral puzzle that psychologists have been using for years.
You've probably heard of the Heinz dilemma before. A guy's wife is dying, there's only one drug that can save her, but the pharmacist is charging this insane price that Heinz just can't afford. So the question is, should he steal the drug? Now the answer itself isn't what's important, it's the reasoning, the why behind the answer.
So, in Gilligan's research, we have this 11-year-old boy named Jake, and he gives a classic answer. He sees it as a logic problem, a conflict of principles. You've got life on one side and property on the other. He confidently decides that life is worth more. So yeah, Heinz should steal the drug. He literally calls it a math problem with humans that you can solve with a formal set of rules.
But then we hear from Amy, who's also 11, and her take is completely different. She doesn't see a math problem at all. She sees a narrative of relationships. Her focus isn't on who's right or wrong, but on the breakdown of communication and the damage this will cause to the whole network of people. Her solution isn't about theft, it's about talking it out, trying to repair those broken connections.
And this just lays it out so clearly, doesn't it? These are the two voices. You've got Jake, operating from an ethic of justice. It's all about rules, rights, and impersonal logic. Then you have Amy, operating from an ethic of care. She's focused on relationships, responsibility, and the context of the story. For one, the problem is a conflict of claims. For the other, it's a failure of human response.
But this ethic of care isn't just some static alternative. It's not that simple. Gilligan discovered that it actually has its own journey of development. And it's a journey that often happens by navigating these really profound personal crises.
By interviewing women who are facing the incredibly difficult decision of whether to have an abortion, Gilligan was able to map out this evolution. It starts with a very practical focus on survival. From there, it moves into a more conventional idea of goodness, where being moral means sacrificing yourself to take care of others. But the final, crucial step is this transition to what she calls the truth of care, an ethic of nonviolence that realizes that being responsible for others has to include being responsible for yourself, too.
I mean, just listen to these words from Sarah, one of the women in the study. They capture the raw, gut-wrenching feeling of this transition. It's not some smooth intellectual exercise. It's a crisis. It's a feeling that your old self has been blasted away. And it's right there, in that broken-down space, that a new, more complete understanding of self and responsibility can finally start to grow.
So, what's the end game here? What does this all lead to? The point was never to say that the ethic of care is better than justice, or that one is for women and one is for men. Not at all. The real goal was to build a much more complete, a much more whole vision of what it means to be a mature human being.
This quote from Alex, a lawyer in one of the studies, just shows this integration happening in real time. Here's a guy who operates in a world that is steeped in the logic of justice and equality, but he comes to see its limits. He realizes that there's this fundamental human need for attachment that an ethic of pure, abstract rights just can't solve.
So ultimately, what Gilligan's work gives us is this richer kind of stereo understanding of humanity. It shows us that real maturity isn't about picking one voice and sticking to it. It's about developing the ability to hear and speak in both. It's about the dance between our need for independence and our need for connection, that constant interplay between justice and care.
And that leaves us with a final thought to chew on. When we look at the conflicts in our own world, from a simple argument with family to a huge debate in society, how might things change if we learn to approach them not just with the voice of justice, but also with the voice of care? What problems could we solve differently if we saw not just a conflict of rights, but also a web of relationships?